Good afternoon, everyone. Peter will start his lecture shortly. I just will take a moment to introduce myself and say a couple of words about the practical matters of this course. So my name is Maria Weimer, and I am one of the coordinators of this course, together with Annette Piersalou, who is my colleague and coordinator. So yesterday I couldn't come in, otherwise I would have talked to you before Peter started teaching, but I usually give a brief introduction to the course and some of the practical issues. So I would like to walk you through the main idea behind this course and then how we will actually organize the learning and the assessment in this course. And I will give you an opportunity to ask questions about that as well. So very briefly, the key idea about this course is that European integration is understood as a gradual process of making, deconstructing, reconstructing, and contesting borders. So in other words, borders is the key concept we work with, and we understand European integration as a process of making and unmaking them. And the interesting part about this course is that we are going to look at these processes of making and unmaking of borders, both material and immaterial, from three different perspectives. So we have the economic perspective this week with Peter's lectures. Then next week we will start by looking at these processes through a legal lens. So we have the legal perspective. And at the end you will also get the regional studies perspective, the Eastern European perspective on European integration. And so in a way, we not only talk about integrating and disintegrating borders, but we are also talking about integrating different perspectives on these questions in the course. And just briefly, so the course builds on the previous course you had in this year, and that is European integration and democracy, right? But there, the main focus, the main concept was democracy, and you looked at the historical and political evolution of the European Union, and part of it was also the role of law in creating that kind of political union. In this course, as I said, we're going to think about borders, and we're going to think about not so much directly the political integration, but more what is the economic justification of making and unmaking of borders, and how then does law actually help bringing about borders or removing them, and what are the political economic implications of that? Who loses out? Who wins as a consequence of these kind of shifting borders? The course is structured in three parts. The first part, as I mentioned, is on the economic and legal integration. And following Peter next week, I will talk to you about the internal dimension, the EU internal market, and the way in which European law has helped both removing borders to free movement of goods, persons and services. And on the other hand, we will also look then in part two on how EU law also helped going beyond the territory of the EU itself and actually trying to expand the European market both to non-European states and sort of what kind of zones of inclusion, exclusion that has created. So we're going to look at EU's trade policy, and colleagues of mine will also talk to you about how EU enlargement works and the consequences and the case of Brexit, so how that kind of has changed not only the physical borders of the EU, but also what kind of processes of disintegration have actually taken place in the case of Brexit. So these are the two parts that I've just mentioned. You see how they are structured in terms of the weeks. and the kind of topics that will be covered. And you can find all of that also on Canvas if you want to take a closer look. Now the last part, part 3, is then about shifting borders in the European neighborhood, and that is also a unique perspective of this course in that it tries to widen our lens of what it means to look at Europe and go beyond the EU and look at the European neighborhood policy to the east and to the south, and at sort of contestations and different zones of belonging there. This is what you're going to look at in part 3. Another colleague, Michael Kemper, will be teaching that part. And so you're going to look at the case of Balkans, but also, of course, ever important, the case of Ukraine and the discussions around enlargement at the moment. And so, week 8, of course, is the exam week. We have quite a large teaching team that will be working with you. So as I mentioned, me and Annette Pirsalou are the coordinators. Then we have lecturers. Peter is one of them. I will be giving the lectures next week. Then we have Matteo Fermeglia and Zamira Xaferi and Michael Kemper following me in the subsequent weeks. And all throughout the course, you will be working on a weekly basis with our tutorial teachers who will be giving the working groups, the Werkgruppe, and so with them you will, in small groups, really work on the assignments and prepare for the examination. Okay, so you will have 2 lectures every week and followed by a tutorial, right? So that's easy, that's the format. All the readings that you need for this class are on Canvas, right? So if you haven't found them, please look again. Everything that you need to prepare for these classes is on Canvas. Keep in mind that for those of you who are in the Dutch track, the Dutch track side of Canvas is linked to the English side, so all the information is basically channeled through the English side, also for those who are in the Dutch track. Assessment. How do we assess in this course? We have formative assessment, which is not graded assessment. That is the work that takes place in the tutorials. And here it's very important for you to do the weekly tutorial assignments. They're not graded, but without them, you're not able to prepare for the examination, for the midterm assessment, and also for the final exam. The tutorials are also the places where you ask all the questions. I should say the lectures and the tutorials. So you can also ask questions in the lectures, you can ask them in the tutorials, you can get feedback on your assignments in the tutorials. So bring your questions there. Because of the size of this class, we are not really able to address individual questions via email unless in very special and urgent cases. But generally, you have questions, bring them to the tutorials or to the lectures. And then the graded assignments, we have 2. We have the midterm assignment, where you will have 3 open questions covering the materials of weeks 2 to 4. And we will start posting these questions at the end of this week. So the first question covering this week will be posted by the end of this week, then the next one by the end of next week, and the third one by the end of the following week, and you will have these 3 questions. So you will have some time to look at them to prepare, and you will have to submit that midterm assignment. All deadlines are on Canvas and on UVA timetable, so you are in charge of checking the deadlines, because these things can, the timetable and so on can change sometimes, so you have to really look up. And then the final exam. The final exam is on-site, is computer-based, and there you have 3 more open questions covering all the weeks. Okay. More information about this, including deadlines, is on Canvas. The final exam accounts for 70% of the final grade, the midterm for 30%, and the resit then, again, is for 70%, which means the midterm cannot be retaken, but the final exam can be retaken. Right, so as I said, dates for both exam and the resit are on your timetable. Please note them down. How do you prepare? Well, you have to read the assigned readings. You have to do the tutorial assignments. You have to attend the lectures. If you can't attend them, you can follow the recordings online. And well, I mean, the rest is self-explanatory, right? So it's your learning process, it's your journey. We are here to support it, but it's up to you to do the work. Good. Do you have any questions concerning this course, practical matters, etc., etc.? Everything is clear? Okay. I'm glad to hear that. I will now let Peter start his class. I wish you a lot of interesting discussions, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week in my lectures on the EU and its internal market. Thanks. Want to take that?
Yes, thank you.
You have the microphone?
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, welcome for the second lecture this week. Today I'm going to talk about the internal market, and I'm going to talk about competition policy in the European Union. And, I'm sorry, I have to apologize in advance because I prepared a PowerPoint. It's way too much. It's way too dense with all the details. I'm afraid the problem is there's so much to tell, and actually we already lost 20 minutes. So I'm quite sure I can't finish it in time. I realize that it will be confusing for students if they get a lot of information and then what do I need to learn and what is it, and so that's always confusing. What I try to do, follow my PowerPoint. Basically, I want to show you the main line of arguments, the things that are interesting and worth considering. I still need to rethink this lecture because it's too much, and I need to find a way to balance between depth and, well, not too many details. All right, let's get started. Literature for today, a chapter by Pomfret and a text by Wilkes on competition policy. That is what I'm going to talk about. Here we have it, the completion of the internal market, the Single Market Act, and competition policy. I want you to have a basic understanding of these topics. I don't expect you to know all the details for the exam, but try to keep the big story in mind. Okay, let me briefly recap what we did yesterday. The post-war Europe, there were two trading blocks, the EEC6, which was a customs union, and the EFTA, which was a free trade association. And we saw that the EEC6, the 6 founding fathers of the European Union, were a bigger bloc that provided more economic benefits and as such attracted more other countries into its orbit, if you will. In the text by Pomfret, he calls it the EEC6 won the battle of the blocks. The EEC was a much more attractive trade model than the European Free Trade Association. And therefore we saw more and more countries join the EEC6, and the EEC6 grew out to what is now the European Union. So there was an initial success of the EEC, and both for the EFTA and the EEC6, they were basically completed in the mid-1960s. And the success of the EEC6 or the EEC can be shown by the amount of intra-EU trade that was created. We talked about trade creation yesterday, and we can see that there was actually indeed quite a significant trade creation within the European Economic Community. We can see that here, 2/3 in 1958, 2/3 of the imports came from outside of the customs union, the EEC6, and in 1919, 2/3 of the imports from the inside of the customs unions. It's, I think, important to realize that the most important trading partners of European countries are other European countries. Yes, China is important, yes, the United States is important, but actually the neighboring countries are way more important than China, than Brazil, or whatever. For the Netherlands, the most important trading partners, the top 3, Germany, Belgium, England, the neighboring countries. So, and that's the case for most of the European countries. Actually, the European Union is a fairly closed economy, if you will, because most of the production, most of the export stays within the European Union. We can see that here over time, the rise of intra-EU trade, meaning the trade between EU member states, and it grew significantly. Today, about 70% of the international trade is from other EU member states. All right, now, so the EEC6 was successful, but unfortunately in the 1970s we met economic stagnation. It was the end of the post-war growth expansion, the golden age, the golden years, in German, das Wirtschaftswunder, or the Trente Glorieux in French. And basically what happened, a series of events caused a crisis in the 1970s. First oil crisis. We saw the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, a system of fixed exchange rate in 1971 and 1973, causing high inflation. So it was a time of unrest and macroeconomic instability. It was a period of stagnation, the 1970s. And a word was coined there, stagflation, a stagnating economy combined with inflation, prices going up. It was also seen as the end of Keynesian aggregate demand management. And here in 1979, a second oil crisis hit the economy. And we can see that, for example, reflected here in the inflation in the UK. We can see 1971, 1979, huge peaks of high inflation, in part caused by the oil crisis, and 20% of inflation is really, really high. On top of that, For example, in the UK and Britain, there was social unrest, there were labor strikes, production stalls, high unemployment. Actually, in the 1970s, Britain was bankrupt. Britain had to take a loan from the IMF because they were out of money and they had to be bailed out by the EMF. So the Western world was in a problematic macroeconomic situation, and that changed with the new president, American President Ronald Reagan. Reagan came into power here on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, Paul Volcker, the president of the central bank. And Ronald Reagan wanted the Federal Reserve Bank to launch an anti-inflation policy, and they did so with raising the interest rates. You can see that on in the graph. The green line represents the interest rate of the central bank. High interest rates makes it expensive to borrow money, and it depressed the inflation. It brought it down. But the problem was an economic crisis, because high interest rates make it expensive to borrow money, so it has a negative effect on the economy. And that is what happened in the 1980s. We have an unemployment crisis in the United States and in Europe. And we can see that here, different unemployment rates for different countries. And we can see that it goes up. Here, after 1980, it goes up. And it stays high at a level somewhere between 8, 10, or 12% for countries like Spain. We also can observe in the 1990 for Germany, the black one, there's the reunification. Germany had to absorb Eastern Germany, which was ineffective. Many companies went bankrupt in East Germany, and it also gave rise to high unemployment even in Germany. And, sorry, the problem was, I think, in part, well, the problem, Europe has rigid labor markets, extended welfare systems, and the shock that was caused by Ronald Reagan basically was not easily absorbed by the labor market in Europe. Again, we can see that here, a comparison of the United States and the Euro era for unemployment. And we can see that after the 1980 crisis caused by Ronald Reagan, unemployment in the United States goes down fairly quickly. The Americans have a more flexible labor market, and in Europe, unemployment remained high. Again, another picture here from France, again, unemployment, and we can see the green, France in blue is really high unemployment rate, and that is really a bad thing for the economy. It's expensive for governments, and it's unproductive. And basically, a new word was coined for this phenomenon, because typically economists think that if there's unemployment and the labor markets are flexible, it will go away easily. But that didn't happen, and we can see we have persistent long-term unemployment, over 10% in France. And a name was coined for that, Eurosclerosis, which sounds like a sort of a disease, and it was meant to sound like a disease, a term coined by a German economist in the 1970s to describe a pattern of economic stagnation in Europe that have resulted from government over-regulation and overly generous welfare systems. All right, so that is what we had, a stagnation in the economy, but also a stagnation in the integration process in Europe. Economies were fragmented, and there was little specialization, and economies of scale Yesterday I showed you that was seen by economists as the basis for prosperity, international trade by specialization and economies of scale. Now, that was about to change in 1985. There was a revival of the European integration process, and the most important figure in that process, without a doubt, was Jacques Delors. And if you ask me, I think he was by far the most important politician in European modern history. I was a fan of Delors. What was he about? Delors, a French, he was a former minister of finance in France, a social democrat, and he was the driving force behind further integration, and he really he was an outspoken pro-integration figure, and he came up with a couple of reports and proposals for deeper European integration, which eventually led to the internal market and to the euro as we have it today. Lord Cockfield was a commissioner in his commission, and basically Delors, he launched two major reports, as I already mentioned. The Single European Act, which resulted in the internal market, and there was the Delors Report, 1989, which established the euro and formed the basis of the Maastricht Treaty. So two very significant achievements of Delors. And here, one of the things that he did, one of his commissioners, Cockfield, wrote a white paper. And a white paper typically is a report, here we have it from the Wikipedia, that informs readers concisely about a complex issue and presents the issuing body's philosophy on the matter. The idea is that it informs readers and proposes solutions or help to make deciders to make a decision. And the proposal, the completing the internal paper by white paper contained 300 measures to remove trade barriers as a response to the economic stagnation that we have had in the 1980s. So the way forward, the way out of the economic crisis was deeper European integration, removal of barriers, trade barriers, and make it easier to trade, and hopefully that would lead to economic growth. And that resulted in the Single European Act. The purpose of the Act was, here we have it from the report, to create an area without internal frontiers in which the free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital is ensured. And of course, you recognize this as the 4 freedoms that we have today. So that was embedded in the Single European Act. And it was a restart of European integration, and the idea was also that there would be a program for removing non-tariff barriers like technical standards or quality requirements to products, that they should be harmonized. Here we have it, non-tariff barriers, all other trade barriers than taxes, for example, border control, differences in technical regulation and standards. And today the European Union is really important in setting standards for products. Actually, it's dominating the world with its product standards. All right. Now, in the report by Cockfield, 3 types of barriers were distinguished: physical trade barriers, technical trade barriers, and fiscal trade barriers, and they all had to be removed. Physical is about the free movement of goods, services, and capital and labor. which was in the end accomplished with the Schengen Agreement also in 1985, which basically guaranteed free movement of people across the Union. Technical borders, we already discussed that. Regulations, quality standards, product standards had to be eliminated because it reduces international trade. And there was the principle of mutual recognition, meaning that all the member states had to recognize these standardized requirements for products. And then there was the fiscal barrier, which was about the disadvantages in taxation. That also had, like state support, differences in taxes, and that had to be harmonized, and we had to do away with that because it reduces competition. All right. Now, the idea was that there would be dynamic economic effects. And what that would mean is that it would be long-term, that it would increase the dynamics of the European economy, that there would be a reduction of monopoly power, less monopoly profits, and that there would be benefits from restructuring, including economies of scale, that doing away with all these borders would boost output, would boost competitiveness of the European economies. All right, and that was quite successful. I will show you that in a moment. But of course, these proposals, there were also critics to that. The idea was that, well, the mainstream interpretation is that market integration is good for consumers, but there's also critiques of people who argue that it basically serves big business. Here we have it, critics. The EU is stop big business drafting our laws. The EU is an engine for neoliberalism. And that was in part because, well, many of the proposals that Cockfield presented in its white paper were actually initiated by the European Roundtable of Industrialists, which was basically a big lobby group who came up with all sorts of proposals to liberalize and free the market, the European market, from trade barriers. All right. So there was the proposal. These proposals, they were accepted and had to be implemented by the member states. And that was quite successful. The single market program was accepted. Here we have it in 1992. 95% of the measures had been transposed into national legislation. As you perhaps know, the EU doesn't make the laws, it's the national member states, but they are based on directives of the European Union. I'm going to skip this. Right. The service, let's do this one. Also, one of the delicate issues in the liberalization of the internal market was the free mobility of service, and that was met with more barriers. There was more reluctance to that. In 2004, the Bolkestein Directive was accepted, but it basically means that there was the Polish plumber problem, meaning there was a lot of opposition of people from Poland or other Eastern European countries with low wages to come to West Europe and work at lower wages. There was a fear of social dumping, and the idea was that less protected labor drives out the better protected labor. The less protected labor, of course, from Poland or Hungary, other Eastern European countries, would have to compete with the established workers in West Europe, and that the Western European workers would lose that, of course, because their wages are way higher. All right, how about capital liberalization in the European Union? Actually, it was quite limited. In the Treaty of the Treaty of Rome, it was mentioned to the extent necessary to ensure the proper functioning of the common market. And actually, still today, we are still struggling with that. The Draghi report 2 years ago also still mentioned that there were calls for trade, for capital liberalization in order to have a strong and dynamic capital market. There were liberalizations in the 1980s, 2 directives to do so, but actually still today it's a little bit underdeveloped. And, well, as I mentioned, the Draghi report called to still have a deeper integration of capital markets today. All right, now, how about this single market program that was launched? Well, how successful was it actually, all these proposals to reduce the trade barriers between countries, to make it easier for labor, capital, services, and goods to go across the border? Well, actually, the single market program was actually very successful. In an evaluation, 1988, here we have it, it was an assessment that the economic growth effect would be 4.5%, and reduced prices in the Union with 6% and created 2 million jobs. Most economists agree with that, find similar results. Here in 2007, a report, a single market review, it contributed to the single market program, contributed to economic growth, 2.15% of GDP, and created 2.75 million jobs. So, taken all together, the conclusion is that the single market program was actually very successful, although there remained all sorts of pockets, corners where still need to be, we need to do away with trade barriers, but actually the program was quite successful. In 2010, a report, an evaluation by Monti from Italy, the Monti report mentioned that the integration still was not complete. There were still places where we could reduce trade barriers, and it was considered that the internal market was really necessary for economic growth, what was accepted by politicians and economists. So basically, there was still, in 2010, still an argument for deeper trade integration into Europe. All right, let's conclude this. What can we say about the internal market? The internal market has been a big success. We have seen removal of trade barriers. That's already started with the customs union, but in the internal market, it's a higher degree of economic integration. and the removal of non-trade barriers is more completed, especially in non-good sectors, that led to economic benefits, economic growth, and jobs being created by the single market program. And we have the critics, of course, on the single market program argue, on the one hand, that Europe is run by big businesses who draft our laws, have a very strong lobby, and of course the member states also had to transfer power, to transfer sovereignty to Brussels, and became less had less influence on their own economy. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's 1:45. Let's have a short coffee break, 10 minutes before we start again. Ladies and gentlemen, let's proceed. We have work to do. I'm going to use this second hour to talk about European competition policy. And here we have it. The idea is that so far in my talk, I talked about what is called negative integration, which means the removal of all sorts of trade barriers. We can see in a long history in the European Union of removing these trade barriers, but actually a common market also requires what is called in the literature a positive integration, meaning building institutions, for example, to safeguard competition and the cooperation of member states in the Union. And competition policy is a set of policy that aim at a sufficient competition level within the internal market in Europe. And the idea is that, of course, that if there are big companies that they have market power or even maybe a monopoly power, and they can use their power to increase prices in such a way that the consumers are worse off. And of course, there are many, many cases in history where we can see businesses abusing their market power. Right. So the idea is the economic rationale behind this by this competition policy is that markets are not perfect in the sense the economists have this idea of perfect competition is where there are many, many small businesses and no one of these businesses has the power to raise prices. Perfect competition. In reality, businesses can have a power. And, for example, they can also decide to work together, to collude, to conspire in order to avoid competition. And actually here, a quote from Adam Smith, the first important economist: people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversations end in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. So basically he's saying when business people meet, they're going to conspire and against the public and raise prices. And that is what we need to avoid. And therefore it is that competition policy is in place. It must safeguard competition. In the Monti report, it was mentioned the goal of competition in all its aspects is to protect consumer welfare by maintaining a high degree of competition in the common market. The problem, of course, is there is, however, an issue with this. Because on the one hand, big companies may be more efficient if they use economies of scale, produce at a larger scale. They can perhaps be more efficient than small companies. So on the one hand, in the European Union, we want businesses to be efficient and make use of economies of scale. I talked about that yesterday. But on the other hand, we don't want businesses being too big to have the power to raise prices or to conspire against the consumers. So the problem is that we need to find a balance for competition. Not too much, but not too little. And that is difficult. And in the European Commission, it's referred to as effective competition or a workable competition. Meaning a competition, well, that is acceptable, that doesn't allow businesses to misuse their power. The origins of competition policy, they go back to the United States. The Sherman Act in 1890, it was an antitrust law, and the idea was that there were also already back then in the late 19th century, businesses too big to fail, businesses too big they could misuse their powers, and as a consequence, the United States government broke down major companies into smaller businesses. What, if you ask me, the American government should do with big tech? We can see that, of course, today they're so powerful. We would probably be better off by breaking these big companies into smaller companies. Trump is not going to do that, of course, but, well, that's a different matter. These ideas, they reached Europe via the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, and the first competition rules were actually already in the European coal and steel community. And introduced in the Treaty of Rome, 1957, it was mentioned to prevent that trade restrictions are replaced by national cartels, and that there was a promotion of market integration. We talked about that. So there's an integration rationale for having competition policy. But later on, it was also a shift to focus on economic efficiency, an efficiency rationale for having competition policy in place. And now, if we look at the modern EU competition policy that we have, there are 5 fields of EU competition policy. 3 apply to the firm, and 2 to the government. To the firms, the undertakings, there's prohibition of, the prohibition of all agreements that prevent, restrict, or distort competition in the internal market, prohibition of abuse of dominance position, that's when companies are big, and supervision of mergers and acquisition that may acquire a dominant position. So that is what the European Commission, the commissioners for competition policy, do today. They supervise the businesses in the European Union with respect to these requirements for competition. And there are 2 fields that refer to the governments, being the member states. In the past, the member states had a lot of state firms, state agencies, and these were considered as public undertakings, and also their liberalization and antitrust policies were in place. For example, the number 5, the supervision of state aid, it is no longer allowed for the member state to subsidize or to benefit particular companies within the economy. That is not allowed in the EU legislation. Let's look into these 5 fields in a little bit more in detail. Cartel prohibition. Cartel is basically companies working together, tacitly or non-tacitly, and basically they make agreements, they divide the markets, and they prohibit that the prices go down. Basically, they divide the market, and that is considered as illegal in the European Union. There can be fines can be given to companies who break these laws, who work together. And actually, when we look into history, we can see here a whole long list of companies that are being fined by the EU. The cartels Here we have it for trucks, TV, companies who produce TVs, car glass. Well, there is a whole lot of a whole series of businesses trying to collude, trying to form a cartel, basically like a drugs cartel that, as we know it, they divide the market. And then, of course, every business can profit from that through higher prices for their product at the expense of the European consumer. Now, that is illegal, and there's a whole lot of cases here. There's some more cases. Deutsche Bank, Philips, Dove, well, a whole list, and it goes on and on. And how about, was Google got a fine recently, I think, or the Commission is, well, always fighting with Google. There are many companies. The bottom line, it still is a relevant policy because there are so many cartels actually in place. Right. Now, this is interesting, the prohibition of a dominant position of a business. And that has to do with the market structure. There's an abuse of market power when there is, for example, a monopolist or oligopolist. Oligopolist meaning the only demander for a particular product. Predatory pricing, unequal treatment. Well, there's a whole lot of misuse of abuse of power. And predatory pricing is in this respect quite interesting. What does it mean? It means that business produces particular goods or services below its cost price at a very low price in order to destroy competitors. And when the competitor goes bankrupt, then the prices, of course, go up again. There's a famous case of Laker Airways, a sort of EasyJet in the early 1980s, and it flew from Europe to the United States at very low costs, and then all the major airlines, they dropped their prices, and they worked out the Laker Airlines to bankruptcy, and then when Laker Airline was gone, the prices again went up. It is prohibited, it is an abuse of a dominant position, but it's really hard to prove for the European Union, for the European Commission. That is one of the problems here. Another couple of examples, the Microsoft case, the media player that was in, I think, 2006, a fine for Microsoft, Nintendo. And in the case of Microsoft, it was also a case of what is called tying, bundling two products together. The issue here in early 2000 years was that Microsoft included its media player in its software, and there was no option to remove it from your computer or to install other media players, and that was considered a misuse of power, a misuse of dominant position by Microsoft, and Microsoft was fined for that. Of course, Microsoft and all the big techs are so powerful that it doesn't hurt them anyway, all these fines. All right, the merger policy. What is a merger? A merger is basically a takeover. Two companies, they go together. Typically, one of the two companies buys up the other company, and that, of course, in itself is not prohibited, but it could be the case that when two companies go together, a big company emerges, a company that is so big that it has market power, that it can influence prices, and that it can make abuse of its dominant position. So again, here we have, again, the same problem. On the one hand, mergers are possibly increasing efficiency. If there's a bigger company, they maybe can benefit from economies of scale. But on the other hand, we don't want businesses to be too big so that they can abuse their market power. And big mergers in the European Union need to be approved by the European Commission in order to see to it whether they don't acquire too big a position, too much of a dominant position. And the interesting thing is, much of that depends on the market structure. And the idea is that there are actually markets that are quite different. The most preferred market that economists would like to see is, on the left hand, perfect competition, many small businesses. Businesses are price taker, meaning they cannot influence the price in the market because there are so many competitors that if they raise their price, another one will be cheaper and they will lose out and go out of business. There's also monopolistic competition. That would be the case when there is competition, but in a particular field, there is only one provider of a particular good. That sounds a little bit complicated, but my favorite example is Harley-Davidson. I mentioned that yesterday. Harley-Davidson, the motorcycle company, is a case of monopolistic competition. There are many producers of motorcycles, but there's only one real Harley-Davidson, and that means that they have some dominant position in that particular sector for motorcycles. Suzuki makes similar motorcycles, but they are not seen as a real substitute for a Harley-Davidson. Oligopoly, meaning there's only one company demanding a particular product. So, for example, in steel making, and there's the monopoly. So here we have it. The market structure can be very different across products and services. And the idea is that we must have some form of, somewhere between perfect competition and monopoly. But again, it is still quite complicated. For example, the Airbus, Boeing, and the airplane industry, there are basically two companies who produce airplanes. For the big airplanes, Airbus and Boeing, and actually, so that's called a duopoly, two companies competing, and there is a really very, very hard competition between Boeing and Airbus. There's an issue that both Boeing and Airbus get subsidies from the state, which is actually not allowed, but it happens. For example, Boeing gets subsidized by the American government through its military department. So the government gives subsidies to the military branch of Boeing, and that keeps Boeing alive. And that destroys competition. But typically, a duopoly, two companies could provide perfect competitive outcomes if the companies are really trying to destroy each other. All right, monopolistic competition, I already talked about that. Harley-Davidson, my favorite example. And a dominant firm, well, basically every big tech company today has a dominant position. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, what have you, all these companies. So whether there is a workable amount of competition, as the EU calls it, depends very much upon the structure of the market. And economists have tried to come up with all sorts of indicators. How can we is it possible to measure the dominant position of companies? And there are a couple of ways to do it. There's, for example, to look at the percentage of the market share of a company. I think Microsoft with Windows has a 90%. 90% of the computer users use Windows, so Microsoft really has a dominant position for operating systems. Another measure that economists have developed is the CR4 concentration ratio. Basically, take the market share of the 4 biggest companies in the business. If that is I think it was 80%, above 80%, there's a real risk of misuse of market power. The Herfindahl index, another measure. But basically, much of the competition in the market is created by the specific features of the market in case and the particular market structure that there is for a particular market. All right, and then there's the, yes, here we have it, and then there's the, we talked about the mergers. Again, there's still the problem, how big should a merger be? A famous case in this field is a Ryanair attempt to take over Aer Lingus a couple of years ago. The idea was Ryanair, they wanted to merge with Aer Lingus, an Irish airliner. Ryanair already had a large stake in Aer Lingus, but Aer Lingus was a smaller company. They were not interested to merge, basically to be taken over by Ryanair, and they went to the European Commission. The European Commission, they rejected a merger between Ryanair and Aer Lingus because it would create a too dominant position in Ireland. There would be only basically one company flying to Ireland, and that would give them a dominant position so that they could raise prices. And there would be a high concentration. Here we have it's 87% of the market share and a monopoly on 46 routes. So the European Commission rejected that. Ryanair, of course, was not pleased and accused the European Commission of privileging national carriers. But this was a case where the European Commission prohibited a merger in order to prevent the misuse of a dominant position. All right, now let's look at the state aid and state and public undertakings. Aid at public entities, basically the member states and public enterprises. For example, in the past, there were state-owned companies. Air France, for example, used to be a company owned by the state. Today, we would find that probably quite odd that Air France was owned by the government, that the pilots were civil servants for the state. And it typically applies, but it typically applies to networks or natural monopolies, train system, public transport, railway system, utilities, energy networks, and all that sort of things, telephone communication. And much of these companies have been privatized over the last decades and are no longer state-owned companies. And also, the idea was that, again, that the privatization of these undertakings would promote competition in the EU and would lower prices. And here again, you can see, of course, this seems like a sort of a neoliberal dogma. Again, a lot of criticism is here in place by people who argue that, well, maybe we shouldn't privatized public. In many countries, I think public transport has been deteriorated as a consequence of privatization. So there is probably some downsides to that. And then we have the prohibition of state aid. I already talked about that. State aid is when governments provide subsidies to businesses in order to help them, to support them financially. And the idea is that state aid, it destroys competition. They give a preferential treatment to national businesses. That could be done in many ways. For example, subsidies, tax advantages, favorable loan at low interest rates, sale or rent of properties, or there are many different ways by which the state can support a particular business. Today, however, that is prohibited by the European Commission, by the European competition policy, although you can, if you look carefully, you can see all sorts of tricky ways how still governments try to support national businesses. Okay, so there are some exceptions to that, but still, yeah, support that is conducive to the internal market, support to integrate regions into internal market. There are some exceptions, but in general, it's seen as unfavorable and undesirable by the Commission. Right, and that brings me to the governance of this competition policy. Who is in place? Well, it is the European Commission, and particularly the Directorate General for Competition Policy. And there is an important role for cartel cases, and we can see that there last couple of years fewer cases of abuse of dominant position, although Microsoft and Google are always in the, the European Commission is continues fighting with big tech companies. They steal our data, they avoid tax paying, and they abuse their power. They increase prices if they can. And the European Commission tried to avoid that. It is a very powerful Directorate General, but in the literature it is noted that the European Commission here in this particular field is that there is an issue with accountability, because the Directorate General for Competition Policy is at the same time, it is a policymaker, a legislator, a prosecutor, and in some instances also a jury. They do all the same, and there's no appeal is possible. The procedure to call for a case at the European Commission, parties can submit a preliminary inquiry, parties can appeal decisions at the European Court of Justice. Right, that is basically what I wanted to talk about. Let's look at the European competition policy. How unique is it? Do other countries have similar competitions? Yes, they do, but actually it's also quite different in a way. Because the European Commission not only wants to promote efficiency, effective competition, but it also aims to promote European integration. And that makes it, I think, very distinct from other competition policies around the world. And since we have the European Union, it's also the member states that need to be supervised, whether they whether they not support national policy, national, what is it, firms. So that makes it very different from, for example, the competition policy in the United States or Japan. And third, it takes place at a multi-level policy, supervision by the European Commission, and there is also a role for national competition authorities. So actually, it's quite a complex level of supervision. The most important cases, however, are done by the European Commission, as I just explained. And then my last slide, I think we already, I showed you this, the internal, what can we conclude? The internal market was really successful. We removed the tariffs, the barriers. It led to economic benefits, but it went hand in hand with a transfer of power. And of course, there are critics who argue that the competition policy and the internal market in particular favor businesses in Europe at the expense of consumers. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's my talk for today. Let me say a few last words on, I know there's a lot of detail, a lot of information in the text. I basically want you to have an understanding about the things that I told you about in the lecture. I want you to be able to distinguish between a customs union, a free trade area, the internal market, and these particular fields of competition policy where the European Commission is acting upon. Thank you. Oh, you dropped sorry. You dropped something, is it?
It's not mine.
Oh, okay, okay.
Thank you, though.
Okay.
saying